You know, if you look at how we typically map out human history, I mean, we really tend to treat it almost like a seismograph.
Oh, yeah, like a literal readout.
Exactly. We stare at this long, flat roll of paper, right? And then suddenly we see this massive, violent, jagged spike just sitting right there in the middle of the 20th century.
Right.
And we point to that spike to World War II and we say, that's the earthquake. That is where the earth just broke open.
But see, focusing exclusively on the rupture itself, like the visible destruction, the actual battlefields, the final casualty counts, it completely ignores the tectonic plates that were, grinding together in the dark for decades beforehand.
Yeah, the invisible stuff.
Exactly. The earthquake is just the release of pressure. The real story, the one we need to talk about, is how that invisible pressure was allowed to build up in the first place.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. We are taking you straight into that invisible pressure, and we're doing it through a really incredibly unconventional lens.
Very unconventional.
Right. So we're looking at this deeply original set of notes we received, which is simply titled World War II.pdf.
Such a simple title for something so dense.
I know, right? And
Yeah.
what makes this document so compelling is that it completely abandons that dry academic perspective, the endless lists of troop movements and supply lines.
Yeah, it skips the textbook stuff entirely.
Exactly. Instead, these notes were written from the perspective of a modern sub-personality who just calls himself Mac.
Jack.
And Mac describes himself as this nerdy, athletic, black guy who relies heavily on humor, to navigate his own internal identity struggles.
His own search for where he fits into the world.
Exactly. So by using Mac's framework, the goal for this deep dive is to analyze the most devastating conflict in human history, not as a sequence of dates, but as a global emotional climate.
Right. We're going to examine what happens when those incredibly common, very human insecurities that literally every single person listening to this feels, things like wounded pride or the paralyzing fear of the other or just that desperate innate need to belong to a group. What happens when those stop being individual psychological struggles?
Because they don't just stay individual, do they?
No, they don't. We want to understand the mechanics of how those exact same emotions become weaponized on a planetary scale.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the jump from an individual just feeling insecure to a globe engulfed in mechanized slaughter, I mean, that requires a massive sequence of systemic failures.
Oh, absolutely. A total breakdown.
Right. The war didn't just fall out of a clear blue sky in 1939. Let's look at the illusion of peace that preceded it. Like, why did the resolution of the First World War virtually guarantee a second one?
Well, to understand that inevitably, you really have to look closely at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919.
The peace treaty.
Right, the quote-unquote peace treaty. We know academically that this treaty placed enormous burdens on Germany, but the psychological mechanism of that burden is what really matters here.
Right, it's not just the money.
Exactly. Specifically, Article 231, which is commonly known as the War Guilt Clause.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a matter of losing territory or, paying financial reparations.
It was deeper than that.
It was. Article 231 forced Germany to formally accept complete, unequivocal moral responsibility for all the loss and damage of World War I.
Wow.
Yeah. It was a legally binding document of total national humiliation. I mean, it stripped away their colonies, decimated their military infrastructure, and
the money, right.
Right. It imposed financial reparations that were mathematically impossible to pay off without literally bankrupting their entire economy for generations.
And this is where Mac's notes have a brilliant way of translating this diplomatic history into something visceral. I mean, he says the Treaty of Versailles is like losing a high-stakes championship game by 50 points.
A total blowout.
Yeah. And then instead of just letting you go to the locker room to process it, the league fines your team everything you own. They bench your best players permanently, and they force you to stand at midfield and publicly apologize to the crowd every single day for the rest of your life.
That's such a perfect analogy.
Right, because when you do that to a competitor, you are not resolving the underlying conflict. You are just compressing it. You're storing it in a pressure cooker for later.
What's fascinating here is that analogy perfectly captures the structural flaw of the treaty. Punishment without any avenue for recovery or redemption, doesn't teach a lesson.
No, it just makes people angry.
Exactly. It breeds a deep, localized obsession with revenge. The architects of Versailles prioritized retribution over reconciliation.
Yeah.
And when a national identity is entirely forged in the fires of humiliation, it mutates. It becomes incredibly fertile ground for political extremism.
And then you layer the Great Depression on top of that already unstable foundation.
Right. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Exactly.
Well,
When the global economy collapsed in the late 1920s and early 30s, I mean, it wasn't just a loss of wealth, it was a total collapse of the social contract.
global unemployment just skyrocketed.
Yeah.
International trade networks completely evaporated overnight.
So for the average person, standing in a bread line, their priority shifts biologically.
Right. They aren't thinking about philosophy.
No. They stop caring about the abstract concept of democratic stability. They shift entirely into pure, primitive survival mode.
Which, of course, puts fragile, newly formed democratic systems like the Weimar Republic in Germany in just an impossible position.
Yeah.
They are trying to hold the line using parliamentary procedure, but the people they are governing are literally starving.
Right. It's like if severe economic desperation makes people stop asking the moral question, is this right? And start asking the desperate question, will this fix my immediate problem?
Right. Will this feed my kid?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then democracies seem structurally disadvantaged in an acute crisis. I mean, it feels like they're insisting on having a polite, moderated group discussion, while a fascist movement just kicks down the door, storms the stage, and grabs the microphone.
Oh, absolutely. Authoritarian systems don't have the burden of seeking consensus. They don't compromise at all.
Right.
They demand absolute capitulation, and they inherently expand. I mean, for a fascist regime to maintain power, it requires constant momentum.
It needs an enemy.
Yes, it requires an endless state of emergency. Conflict isn't an accidental byproduct of a fascist state. Conflict is the core operating policy.
Wow.
And the primary mechanism figures like Hitler and Mussolini used to seize that control was the weaponization of identity.
Right. Giving people a scapegoat.
Exactly. They recognize that people who feel alienated and economically destroyed are desperate for a cohesive narrative that explains their suffering.
And Mack writes about this with incredible self-awareness. He talks about his own modern struggles with identity, like constantly calculating if he's acting black enough for certain circles or, too nerdy for others.
It's exhausting.
It really is, trying to navigate the nuance of who he is supposed to be. And when he looks at the 1930s, he sees the most terrifying possible, quote-unquote, solution to that identity crisis.
Right, because authoritarian regimes didn't offer a space for self-discovery.
No, they forcefully handed you a rigid, unyielding category. They told their populations, no more nuance, no more confusing questions about who you are. You are this. And all of your suffering is the direct fault of anyone who is not this.
They manufactured a hyper-simplified reality. By stripping away the profound complexity of individual human beings, they reduced entire populations to biological or ideological categories.
Oh.
And the chilling psychological reality is that once a society allows artificial categories to completely override basic humanity, the unthinkable just becomes mundane.
It becomes normal.
Exactly. Violence against the designated other stops feeling like a moral transgression. It gets reframed as a civic duty. It feels like restoring order or, cleaning up.
Man. And while this horrific internal psychological manipulation was metastasizing, the international systems that were explicitly designed to prevent it from spreading just proved to be entirely hollow.
You're talking about the League of Nations, right?
Yeah, the collective security apparatus that was supposed to make sure another world war was physically impossible.
Well, the League of Nations was structurally compromised from its inception. I mean, it was designed to enforce international law, but it possessed absolutely no independent military capability to actually do so.
None at all.
Right. Furthermore, massive geopolitical players, primarily the United States, refused to join. They adopted a strictly isolationist stance.
Right, staying out of it.
So when systemic tests arose, like when Japan manufactured a pretext to invade Manchuria in 1931, or when Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League issued strongly worded condemnations, but took no meaningful physical or economic action.
And Mack has a great way of describing this systemic failure. He says it's like playing an incredibly physical, high-stakes sport where the referees just suddenly, inexplicably stop blowing the whistle.
Yeah, exactly.
At first, players test the waters, right? A little holding, a little shoving.
Just to see what they can get away with.
Right. And when nothing happens, the game turns aggressive. Then it turns violent. By the time someone tries to step in and finally call a foul, the culture of the game has entirely broken down. The rules no longer exist.
And that breakdown of the rules leads directly to the diplomatic strategy of appeasement.
Right, Munich.
Yes, the most infamous example is the Munich Agreement of 1938. Britain and France, who were absolutely terrified of triggering another continent-wide slaughter, literally negotiated away the Sudetenland, which was a sovereign territory of Czechoslovakia, and handed it to Germany.
Just gave it away?
Yeah. The diplomatic logic was that by giving Hitler what he claimed was his final territorial demand, his appetite would be satisfied.
But appeasement assumes you are negotiating with someone who actually shares your desire for peace.
Right.
If conflict is their actual policy, then giving them territory doesn't satisfy an appetite. It just feeds a predator. It signals deep, fundamental weakness.
Absolutely.
It buys time, sure, but it buys time for the aggressor to stockpile more weapons, fortify their borders, and prepare for the next demand.
So when Germany finally invaded Poland in September of 1939, that act did not create the pressure.
No.
It was merely the spark hitting a powder keg that had been meticulously packed for 20 years. The unaddressed humiliation, the economic despair, the weaponized tribal identity, the failure of collective security, all of those elements had reached critical mass.
And once that structure ruptured, the violence didn't just stay neatly contained on the European continent. It violently expanded to consume the geography of the entire planet.
It really did.
So let's examine the sheer physical environments and mechanics of what total war actually looked like in execution.
Well, the geographical scale of World War II fundamentally breaks the human brain's capacity for comprehension. We're talking about a conflict fought across vastly different, actively hostile environments.
Right, it wasn't just one type of terrain.
Not at all.
Yeah.
You have the Western Front, characterized by dense European hedgerows, grinding infantry advances, and the systematic reduction of ancient industrialized cities to ash and rubble. Then you look at the Eastern Front, which was defined by a scale of slaughter that is almost impossible to articulate. There, armies weren't just fighting each other, they were fighting the incomprehensible brutalization of the Soviet winter.
The environment itself is lethal.
Exactly. The cold, the mud, and the sheer vastness of the Russian steppe became weapons themselves.
And Mack compares this multi-front reality to being trapped in a video game where a sadistic programmer forces you to switch game modes right in the middle of a match.
Oh, that's good.
Right. You spend years fighting this massive mechanized strategy game in the snows of Europe, but then the perspective violently shifts to the Pacific theater.
A completely different world.
Yeah, suddenly you aren't playing a strategy game anymore. You're dropped into a survival horror scenario.
Right.
You are fighting in dense, suffocating, disease-ridden jungles. The heat is unbearable. You can't see the enemy through the canopy. But the psychological pressure of knowing you are constantly being watched never stops.
And that's not even mentioning the North African campaign, fought in blinding, abrasive desert environments where logistics and water supply dictated military strategy as much as tanks did.
Wow. Yeah.
But what ties all these disparate environments together is the doctrine of total war.
Right.
This was not a conflict fought between professional armies on designated battlefields while the civilian population just, went about their daily lives.
Yeah.
Total war means that the entirety of a nation's resources, its agricultural output, its industrial factories, its scientific institutions, and its civilian population are completely mobilized to destroy the enemy's capacity to exist.
Which completely erases the concept of a quote-unquote safe home front.
Exactly.
Civilians were no longer considered tragic collateral damage. They were reclassified as legitimate primary targets. The goal wasn't just to defeat the army. The goal was to break the psychological will of the people building the weapons.
Right.
And that's why we see an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths, the vast majority of whom never even wore a uniform.
Exactly. And the methods of warfare evolved at a terrifying pace to facilitate this destruction. The Germans introduced the concept of blitzkrieg, or lightning war.
Right, speed and surprise.
Yes. Mechanically, this relied on the deep integration of motorized infantry, concentrated panzer tank divisions, and close air support from the Luftwaffe.
Working together perfectly.
Right. They would bypass heavily fortified enemy strongpoints, striking deep into the rear to sever communication and supply lines, causing total psychological paralysis within the enemy command structure.
But the blitzkrieg required space and speed to operate, right? When that momentum stalled, the war devolved into a completely different kind of hell. Look at the urban warfare in
Yeah.
Stalingrad.
Oh, Stalingrad. Yeah, that neutralized the German advantage of maneuverability entirely. When a city is bombed into a sprawling landscape of concrete rubble, tanks become practically useless.
Right, they can't move.
They get stuck and they become easy targets. The fighting there devolved into what the Germans called Rettenkrieg, or Rat War. It was a localized, grinding, static nightmare fought room by room, stairwell by stairwell, and sewer by sewer. The mechanics of survival there relied entirely on sheer human attrition and a willingness to absorb unimaginable casualties.
I really want you listening to this to try and construct the sensory experience of this environment. Mac breaks this down in his notes using an audio engineering metaphor.
Okay, I love this part.
Yeah, he says if you were to mix a sonic track for World War II, it's not just explosions. The underlying low bass, the frequency you feel in your chest before you even hear it, is the constant grinding, heavy vibration of Panzer and T-34 tank treads chewing up the earth.
Yeah.
The hi-hats keeping the terrifying rhythm, or the sharp, unyielding staccato snaps of machine guns. And the distortion, that clipping, overwhelming noise that blows out the speakers and makes your ears bleed, that is the strategic aerial bombings. It is an environment of absolute, unbroken sensory overload.
The human nervous system is simply not evolved to process that level of sustained acoustic and physical trauma.
No, not at all.
And the reason that trauma was so ubiquitous is because this became a war of industrial systems versus industrial systems. The technological acceleration was entirely decoupled from any ethical framework.
Science without conscience.
Exactly. Science was wholly co-opted by the military apparatus. You see the rapid development of radar to detect incoming bomber fleets. You see the birth of modern computing through the intricate intelligence warfare of breaking the Enigma code.
The scientists weren't sitting in labs debating, should we build this new weapon? What are the moral implications?
No, not at all.
The pressure of the war meant they were only asking, can we build this fast enough to kill them before they build one to kill us?
Which logically culminates in the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb. Mechanically, splitting the atom didn't just create a bigger explosion, it fundamentally altered the existential trajectory of the human species.
Humanity basically unlocked a cheat code that was so devastatingly powerful, so absolute in its destructive capability, that it terrified itself into ending the match.
It really did.
We realized in the flash of a single microsecond that we now possess the physical capacity to unmake the entire world.
But while this global battlefield was dictated by massive industrial systems and apocalyptic technologies, we have to remember the human element directing them. The nations mobilizing these forces were fighting for vastly different and frequently contradictory reasons.
Right.
The traditional historical narrative often smooths over these complexities, but we need to examine the players and the illusions they operated under.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's challenge the dominant narrative right here. In popular culture, World War II is almost universally presented as this clean, binary struggle. Pure, unadulterated good versus pure, mustache-twirling evil.
Right, like a Marvel movie.
Exactly. But Mac's notes force us to look much closer at the underlying mechanics of both the Axis and the Allies. Let's start with the Axis powers. Nazi Germany's motivation is rooted in this horrific, pseudoscientific quest for Lebensraum, or living space.
And the concept of Lebensraum wasn't just a vague desire for more land. It was a highly calculated demographic and agricultural strategy.
Right.
The Nazi leadership believed that to secure a 1,000-year empire, they needed the vast agricultural resources of Eastern Europe to feed their population, completely independent of global trade.
But there were people already living there.
Exactly. Their plan explicitly required the mass starvation, enslavement, and extermination of the Slavic populations currently living there to make room for German settlers. It was a genocidal interpretation of manifest destiny, fueled by a constructed mythology of racial supremacy.
Then you look at fascist Italy under Mussolini, and their mechanical drive is completely different. They aren't driven by the same obsessive biological fanaticism as Germany.
No, not at all.
Italy's driving force is a massive national status anxiety. They had felt historically slighted by the other European powers, and they wanted to revive the mythical glory of the Roman Empire to prove they were a Tier 1 dominant global force.
They wanted the prestige of an empire without possessing the industrial or military infrastructure required to actually maintain one.
And Mac's analogy for Italy is brilliant. He says Italy is like the guy on your intramural sports team who is desperately trying to prove he belongs in the professional leagues, but he is massively overestimating his own stats.
Right.
He talks a huge game, picks a fight with the biggest guy on the opposing team, and then immediately needs Germany to bail him out when things go wrong. It's a deeply insecure motivation.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
And then there is Imperial Japan. They are fighting for survival, but a very specific, aggressive form of it.
Japan's mechanics of motivation were heavily tied to resource scarcity. As an island nation rapidly industrializing, they possessed virtually no domestic oil, rubber, or iron, the fundamental building blocks of a modern empire.
Which they needed to survive.
Right.
Hey.
They view the expansion into China and Southeast Asia as an absolute economic necessity.
They were simultaneously driven by a fierce national pride and a deep-seated panic. They absolutely refused to be boxed in, dictated to, or colonized by Western imperial powers who already controlled massive swaths of Asia.
Right. They saw what was happening around them.
So they decided to aggressively build their own empire first.
Now, if we look across the ideological aisle at the Allied powers, the picture is incredibly complex and deeply compromised.
Very compromised.
The United Kingdom, for instance, enters the war fighting a desperate, valiant battle for direct national survival against the Luftwaffe. But strategically, their long-term motivation is to maintain the balance of power on the European continent and, crucially, to preserve their own massive global empire.
Which brings us to the Soviet Union. Their motivations shift so drastically it gives you whiplash.
It really does.
Initially, they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact with Germany, actively dividing up Eastern Europe between them. But the moment Hitler broke that pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union, the Soviet motivation shifted instantly from geopolitical maneuvering to raw, existential panic.
At that point, the Soviet Union was not fighting to spread global socialism or protect democratic ideals.
Yeah.
They were fighting because if they lost, their population would be subjected to the extermination policies of Lebensraum. It was a war of absolute biological survival.
And the United States enters the conflict offensively. They largely maintained an isolationist stance until the Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor forced their hand.
Right.
Once engaged, the U.S. framed their immense industrial and military involvement around the defense of global democratic ideals and the liberation of occupied territories. Meanwhile, China is fighting an incredibly brutal, prolonged war of anti-imperial resistance against the Japanese, while simultaneously tearing itself apart internally in a vicious civil war between nationalist and communist factions.
And to remain entirely objective about the historical reality presented in these notes, we have to acknowledge the immense, glaring internal contradictions within the Allied nations.
Really do.
The Soviet Union absorbed the most horrific casualties to defeat a totalitarian invader, yet Stalin maintained a regime of massive, lethal internal repression, purges, and a vast network of gulags that destroyed millions of his own citizens.
And the United States mobilized its entire economy to fight for freedom and defeat a regime obsessed with racial purity in Europe, while legally enforcing brutal racial segregation and Jim Crow laws at home.
Right.
And actively placing its own citizens of Japanese descent into internment camps.
Exactly.
The British framed themselves as the ultimate defenders of liberty against subjugation, while simultaneously ruling over a vast colonized global empire, particularly in India, that was actively demanding its own freedom.
The grand strategic narratives rarely align with moral purity. Geopolitics at that scale is almost entirely a calculus of power and survival.
Which makes me want to push back even harder on the way we teach this. If we accept the reality of these internal contradictions, isn't the good versus evil narrative just a comfortable psychological blanket we throw over the past?
Yeah.
Look at these players. Wasn't World War II really just a massive, chaotic clash of planetary survival instincts? A horrific scenario where the quote-unquote good guys had to actively ally themselves with one form of brutal authoritarianism, Soviet Union, simply because they needed their manpower to defeat a worse, more immediate form of authoritarianism in Germany.
That is the incredibly uncomfortable reality of the conflict. The alliance was one of sheer necessity, not shared values.
Right.
But having established these massive macro-level geopolitical motivations, we need to shift our focus downward. We have to ask what this grand compromise strategy actually looked like for the human beings on the ground who were forced to execute it with their own bodies.
Because nations, as abstract concepts, do not bleed. Governments don't freeze to death in a foxhole. People do.
Yes.
Let's zoom in on the lived experience of this war. and the distinct phases of exhaustion that defined it. Because the disconnect between the leaders playing chess in a war room and the pawns on the board is vast.
When you analyze the lived experience of the frontline soldier, the ideological grandstanding of the political leaders evaporates almost immediately.
Oh, completely.
Down in the mud of the trenches, in the suffocating heat of the Pacific jungles, or in the frozen rubble of a bombed-out city, soldiers were rarely fighting for abstract, high-minded concepts like the preservation of Western democracy or the triumph of fascism.
Right.
The mechanics of their motivation became hyper-localized. They were fighting to protect the man in the foxhole right next to them.
Mack's notes absolutely nail the psychology of this. He points out that you don't engage in philosophical debates about the merits of the gold standard or global hegemony while artillery shells are landing 50 feet away.
No, you definitely don't.
Brotherhood, trauma bonding, and the immediate desperate instinct for physical survival become infinitely stronger than any political manifesto.
Yeah.
Your entire universe shrinks down to your squad, the functionality of your weapon, and surviving the next 10 yards of dirt.
Exactly.
But soldiers were only a fraction of the people trapped in this machine. Think about the civilians. I want you to imagine your entire existence being interrupted in 1941.
The civilian psychological load is entirely different, but equally devastating.
Imagine your daily routine, your career aspirations, your sense of fundamental safety, all of it suspended indefinitely. You are suddenly dealing with strict food rationing where you can't get basic staples like butter or sugar.
Right.
You live with the constant gnawing terror of the air raid sirens waking you up at 2 a.m., forcing you to grab your children and sprint into a dark cellar, hoping your house is still there when the sun comes up.
Yeah, just hoping to survive the night.
And you endure the agonizing, silent wait for letters from the front lines that might never arrive. And despite all of that crushing anxiety, you still have to wake up every single morning, go to work in a munitions factory, and function.
It's unbelievable.
How does a civilian population carry the immense emotional weight of a total war they didn't ask for and didn't start?
They carry it because the alternative is annihilation. It highlights the terrifying resilience of the human spirit under the worst possible conditions. We adapt to terror.
Yeah.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, that resilience was tested through very distinct, grueling phases as the momentum of the war physically shifted. The early phase, roughly from 1939 to 1941, was defined almost entirely by Axis dominance.
Right, they seemed unstoppable.
The operational mechanics of the Blitzkrieg we discussed earlier made the German and Japanese militaries appear utterly invincible. The Allied forces were entirely reactive, constantly back on their heels, trying to plug holes in a collapsing dam.
But the mechanics of that dominance contain the seeds of its own destruction, right? The phase of Axis expansion inevitably created structural cracks.
Absolutely.
Hitler makes the fatal strategic decision to launch Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union and opening up the unimaginably vast Eastern Front. Simultaneously, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor.
This is the critical turning point of overextension. The psychological confidence of the Axis powers metastasizes into strategic hubris. They expanded their supply lines beyond their logistical capacity to maintain them.
Right, they just reached too far.
And when you overextend in warfare, you eventually hit a wall. For Germany, that wall was the Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942 and early 1943. For Japan, it was the Battle of Midway in the Pacific.
At Stalingrad, it wasn't just a military defeat. The invincible aura of the German army was psychologically shattered.
Completely.
They poured an entire field army into that city and lost them completely. Hundreds of thousands of highly trained soldiers that their demographic reality meant they could never replace. From that moment on, the fundamental physics of the war changed.
It ceases to be a war of Axis momentum and transforms into a massive, slow-moving pincer movement.
Right.
You have the Allied surge pushing from the west, solidified by the incredible logistical achievement of the D-Day landings in 1944. And from the east, you have the relentless, massive juggernaut of the reorganized Soviet Red Army pushing toward Berlin.
Just a crushing weight.
Exactly. The war mechanically shifted from a contest of tactical brilliance to a brutal mathematical equation of Allied industrial resources grinding down Axis survival capabilities.
Until we finally reached the face of collapse in 1945. The complete destruction of Berlin, Hitler's suicide in a bunker, and the apocalyptic dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It represents a total planetary system breakdown.
And throughout all these agonizing phases, across millions of square miles, millions of individual human beings were making choices every single day.
Every day.
What Mac's notes emphasize, and this is vital to understanding history, is that almost nobody wakes up in the morning, looks at themselves in the mirror, and consciously thinks, I'm the villain of the global story today.
Wow, yeah.
They wake up believing their actions are justified by their specific context. They believe they are protecting their family, or they are fixing a broken societal system, or they are simply following orders to survive another day.
That is easily the most haunting concept in this entire deep dive. This massive planetary tragedy, this mountain of corpses, doesn't occur because tens of millions of people suddenly decided they wanted to be cartoonishly evil.
No.
It occurs because human beings possess a terrifying capacity to rationalize their actions within a warped system. Which brings us to the core mechanics of how a society actually warps. Let's look at the 6 specific systems that hold human beings together and see what happens when they are placed under extreme, sustained pressure.
Well, the notes break down the societal structure into 6 interdependent systems, all of which were pushed far past their breaking points during the war.
Okay, let's go through them.
The first is the social system. Under the pressure of total war, we see an intense duality emerge. On one hand, you witness incredible, localized unity and solidarity. You see civilians pulling together during the Blitz in London, sharing meager rations, running into burning buildings to dig their neighbors out of the rubble.
Right, people helping each other.
Exactly. The pressure creates intense communal bonds.
But the exact same pressure also causes horrific social fracture. When resources are scarce and fear is high, humans instinctively look for a scapegoat.
Yeah.
You see heightened xenophobia, the rapid scapegoating of minority populations, and the dark paranoia of neighbors turning on each other in occupied territories, trading the lives of their fellow citizens for temporary favor with the occupying forces.
Which necessitates the warping of the second system, the political system.
Right.
In a time of acute crisis, political power always, without exception, centralizes. The mechanics of running a total war do not allow for the slow, deliberative process of democratic debate.
It's too slow.
Way too slow. We see democracies legally granting their executive branches sweeping, unprecedented emergency powers to bypass legislatures. Authoritarian regimes simply tighten their existing grip into an absolute stranglehold, criminalizing any form of dissent.
But how does a democratic society willingly hand over control of its daily life to a centralized military authority without a revolution?
Because the public willingly trades their liberty for the promise of security. They accept the centralization because it is the only way to manage the third system, the economic system.
The money in the factory.
Exactly. The sheer physics of economic mobilization during WWII are difficult to overstate.
Yeah.
A government cannot rely on the free market to produce tanks.
Yeah.
Factories that were building consumer automobiles on a Friday were forcefully retrofitted over the weekend to begin producing heavy bombers on Monday.
That's fast.
Yes. Consumer goods practically vanished from the market, replaced entirely by military output. The entire function of society shifted mechanically from a model of living to a model of pure producing.
But humans aren't machines. You can't just flip a switch and force them to work double shifts in a munitions factory indefinitely. To keep people producing, to keep them willing to sacrifice their sons and their comforts, you have to manipulate the fourth system, the ideological system.
Right, the propaganda.
This is where the narrative of the war must be intensely managed and radicalized.
Exactly. The enemy must be entirely stripped of their humanity.
Mack points this out brilliantly. He notes that if you actually allow yourself to see the soldier in the opposing trench as a human being...
If you see them as a person.
Right. If you recognize that the kid in the other uniform misses his mother just as much as you do, that he's just as scared and cold as you are, the whole psychological scaffolding of the slaughter starts to collapse.
Falls apart.
You cannot systematically kill people you empathize with. Therefore, the ideological system has to work overtime to radicalize the mindset, portraying the enemy as monsters, vermin, or an existential disease that must be eradicated to sustain the violence.
And that sustained violence drives the evolution of the fifth system, the military. Warfare is the ultimate engine of ruthless Darwinian adaptation.
Evolve or die.
Literally. Strategies and weapon systems that were considered cutting-edge and dominant in 1939 were hopelessly obsolete by 1942. Military structures have to adapt their tactics under live fire, incorporating new technologies, and discarding failed doctrines instantly, because the penalty for failing to evolve is literal death.
which acts as a massive accelerant for the sixth system, technology. Innovation in wartime isn't born out of innocent academic curiosity in a sterile university lab. It is born out of the intense, terrifying pressure cooker of evolve or lose.
Right.
That is the specific mechanical pressure that gives us radar, that forces the invention of early computing to break cryptographic codes, and that allows theoretical nuclear physics to be weaponized into an atomic bomb in less than half a decade.
The technological advancement is exponential, but it is entirely directed toward destructive ends.
So what does this all mean? Looking at these six systems stretching, warping, and feeding into each other, I have to pose a genuinely challenging thought.
Okay.
We know that in a crisis, people trade their freedom for stability. The leaders centralize power to control the systems. But as this war dragged on for years, mutating into this planet-sized industrial meat grinder, did the leaders actually control the war anymore?
Oh, that's a great question.
Or did the war itself, this massive, hungry, autonomous system of production and destruction, start controlling them?
That is a profound philosophical and historical question. The momentum of total war creates a logistical and psychological inertia that is almost impossible for any individual leader to arrest.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the ultimate tool governments use to try and maintain the illusion of control: information. World War II was as much a war of cognitive perception as it was a war of physical bullets.
Governments on all sides heavily utilized radio broadcasts, meticulously designed propaganda posters, and aggressively censored personal letters to shape the reality their citizens experienced.
Right, they had to.
They understood a fundamental mechanical truth of total war. You are not just fighting the enemy army on the battlefield, you are actively fighting the story of the war at home.
The narrative.
Exactly. You have to carefully manage the narrative to keep civilian morale from collapsing, because the moment the public stops believing in the necessity of the war, the factories stop producing shells, the logistics fail, and the war is mathematically lost.
This aggressive manipulation of information creates multiple, entirely conflicting realities, depending on where you physically stand.
What do you mean?
Well, consider a massive strategic aerial bombing raid. To the population of the nation dropping the bombs, reading the heavily curated morning newspaper, that raid is framed as a glorious, triumphant victory that degrades the enemy's capacity and brings peace one day closer.
Right.
To the population on the ground living under the bombs, it is the apocalyptic, unjustifiable devastation of their homes, their hospitals, and their families. Information physically shapes perception, and in a wartime environment, perception becomes the only reality that matters to the person experiencing it.
But eventually, the physical systems can no longer sustain the pressure. The economies break, the armies collapse, the war ends. But when the guns finally stopped firing in 1945, it didn't just hit a reset button and restore peace.
Oh, far from it.
It handed the exhausted survivors a completely new, deeply flawed, and heavily traumatized reality. Let's deconstruct the aftermath of this conflict, the myths we tell ourselves about it, and the true, lasting costs.
The immediate physical aftermath of World War II was a complete and utter redrawing of the global geopolitical map. Germany, the aggressor that started the conflict in Europe, is utterly defeated, its territory militarily occupied and physically partitioned into East and West by the victorious powers.
Right.
Japan's imperial ambitions are crushed, and the home islands are occupied by the United States, who fundamentally restructure their government and constitution.
And the old European empires, primarily Great Britain and France, are technically on the winning side of the ledger.
Technically.
But practically, they are financially ruined, their cities are heavily damaged, and their militaries are completely exhausted. This marks the definitive beginning of the end for global European colonialism. They simply no longer possess the strength to hold on to their overseas territories.
Which leaves a massive, gaping power vacuum on the global stage.
Right.
That vacuum is immediately filled by the two remaining nations with the industrial and military capacity to project power, the United States and the Soviet Union. You now have two distinct superpowers with entirely incompatible economic and ideological worldviews, both possessing enormous militaries and soon both possessing apocalyptic nuclear weapons, staring each other down over the ruins of Europe.
I love how Mac frames this in his notes. He uses another gaming metaphor. He says, the final boss of the game gets beaten, the screen fades to black, and then the sequel menu pops up immediately.
That's exactly what it felt like.
The end of World War II isn't actually an ending. It is just the violent, traumatic prequel to the Cold War. The conflict also catalyzed the creation of the United Nations, which was a desperate structural attempt to create a forum for diplomacy to prevent this specific scale of war from ever happening again.
Right.
And it led directly to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, a geopolitical event that fundamentally reshaped the mechanics of the Middle East to this day.
Yet, despite the massive, complex geopolitical shifts, the way public memory processes this aftermath is often heavily shrouded in comfortable mythology. We need to systematically deconstruct some of these myths.
Yes, let's do that.
The first is the myth we challenged earlier, that the war was a simple, morally pure crusade of unblemished good defeating pure evil. The historical reality of alliances with totalitarian regimes and the maintenance of colonial empires shatters that simplicity.
Another major myth, particularly in American memory, is the idea that the atomic bombs alone magically ended the war in the Pacific.
While the nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were horrifyingly decisive and unprecedented events, mechanically, Japan's capacity to fight had already been systematically destroyed.
Right, they were already beaten.
They were facing a total naval blockade that cut off all their essential resources. Their wooden cities were being relentlessly subjected to conventional firebombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands, and they had just suffered the massive psychological and military shock of the Soviet Union declaring war and rapidly invading their holdings in Manchuria.
Wow.
The bombs were the final devastating blow, but they were not the sole cause of the surrender.
We also have to tackle the myth of battlefield heroism winning the war on its own. We all love the cinematic narratives. We love the movies about the brave, diverse squad of guys taking the heavily fortified hill against all odds.
We do.
And that frontline heroism was incredibly real, and it was vital. But Mac's notes remind us of a colder, more mathematical truth. That visceral, on-the-ground bravery was matched and functionally superseded by the sheer, unglamorous, relentless output of industrial logistics.
War at that scale is fundamentally an exercise in supply chain management.
Wait, let me expand on that. It wasn't just won by the guy pulling the trigger. The war was won by meticulously maintained train schedules.
Right.
It was won by the sheer tonnage of steel production in places like Pittsburgh or the Ural Mountains. It was won by the millions of women working exhausting double shifts in munitions factories, riveting bomber chassis together. It was a victory of spreadsheets, fuel supply allocations, and raw, boring industrial mass as much as it was a victory of the rifle.
And acknowledging that mechanical reality forces us to confront the true costs of the victory.
Yeah.
We have mentioned the staggering demographic hole of tens of millions dead, but there is also a profound, lingering moral cost.
Oh, absolutely.
In the desperate pursuit of defeating fascism, the Allied powers systematically normalized the area bombing of civilian population centers. They normalized the concept of nuclear terror as a legitimate tool of statecraft. That represents a deep moral injury to the human psyche that the world still carries and wrestles with today.
Which brings up the deeply uncomfortable concept of worth it. When we look back, people often ask, was it worth it? I think we have to be incredibly careful with how we use that phrase.
Very careful.
Resisting Axis aggression was absolutely fundamentally necessary. Letting the ideology of fascism and genocide consume the globe was simply not an option for human survival. But saying it was worth it makes it sound like a transaction we are happy with, like we got a good deal.
Right, like it was a bargain.
Victory came with unbelievable generational baggage.
It also requires us to examine the massive opportunity cost of the conflict.
I really want you, the listener, to pause and think about this opportunity cost. Think about the sheer volume of human labor, the brilliant scientific ingenuity, the billions of gallons of fuel, the millions of tons of metal, and the flawless global logistics required to wage World War II.
It's unfathomable.
During those 6 years, humanity proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it possesses the mechanical ability to fully mobilize on a planetary scale. We proved we can coordinate the entire globe toward a single, unified goal.
The physical capacity is not in question. The motivation is.
Right. So why do we so often wait until we are actively trying to slaughter each other to prove it? Imagine the alternative timeline.
That's a staggering thought.
Imagine what could have been built, what global diseases could have been cured in a decade, what systemic poverty could have been eradicated if that exact same level of frantic planetary mobilization had been directed toward preserving human life instead of industrializing its destruction.
This raises an important question about how we construct our historical memory. Why do we so easily romanticize that era as the greatest generation, while simultaneously forgetting or actively ignoring the immense, silent psychological trauma they brought home with them and buried.
We just sweep it under the rug.
We do.
Yeah.
Why do we consistently narrow our cultural memory almost exclusively to the European theater, to the beaches of Normandy and the London Blitz, while completely marginalizing the massive, catastrophic suffering and complex geopolitics of the Asian and African theaters?
Right.
We curate our memory of the war to make it feel more comfortable, more heroic, and more palatable. But the mechanical reality is infinitely more complex and deeply tragic.
And honestly, nobody understands the exhausting complexity of curating an image better than Mac. Which brings us to the final and most personal section of our deep dive, the Mac perspective. What does it actually mean to survive a war with your soul intact?
Yeah, let's look at that.
Let's take Mac, this modern, self-aware, identity-juggling, humorous guy, and drop him mentally into a concrete bunker in 1943. How does he function?
If we isolate Mac as a subpersonality navigating the reality of a war zone, we know immediately he wouldn't be the general in the tent moving the grand strategic pieces on the map.
No.
Nor would he be the stoic, silent, emotionally deadened killer. Mac's defining traits are his adaptability and his humor. In a combat unit, he would be the morale guy.
The good glue.
Exactly. He would be the crucial emotional translator between the wildly different backgrounds and personalities crammed into his squad. As the notes beautifully describe him, he would be the bartender of the bunker.
I love that image. He's the guy cracking a perfectly timed joke when the tension before an assault is so thick you could cut it with a knife. He's the one diffusing the fights between his own squad mates.
Right.
But let's look mechanically at the internal psychological conflicts he would face doing that. The first is the crushing weight of identity under pressure. Military structures demand absolute conformity.
They have to.
They explicitly want to strip away your individual complexities, your quirks, your personal history, and reduce you to a single functional role.
Soldier.
And Mac already struggles in his modern civilian life with the pressure of shrinking himself to fit societal expectations. The tension of being the jock versus being the nerd, navigating racial expectations.
Yeah, that's already hard enough.
In a combat environment, the pressure to conform isn't just about avoiding social awkwardness. It's a matter of literal life and death. Does he shrink his personality to fit the rigid, masculine, hyper-aggressive military mold? Or does he risk staying authentic and being misunderstood by his commanding officers in an environment where misunderstanding can get you and your friends killed?
Then there's the profound internal conflict of humor versus reality. Mac uses humor as a shield. It's his primary coping mechanism for anxiety.
Right.
But in the relentless grinding trauma of prolonged combat, a critical question emerges. Is his joking actually helping his squad process the horror they're witnessing? Or is it just an elaborate psychological mechanism for avoiding a reality that is simply too dark to face?
This directly ties into the ultimate human conflict: belonging versus authenticity. In a military unit, belonging to the group is the only way you survive physically.
You need the group.
If you are ostracized, if the group doesn't trust you, you are in immediate danger when the bullets start flying. Does Mac conform entirely to the group's expectations to ensure he belongs, completely sacrificing his true internal self in the process? Or does he try to stay authentic and risk isolation? Psychologically, this is a profound and incredibly dangerous tightrope walk. In any prolonged conflict, strong, cohesive interpersonal bonds are critical to a unit's combat effectiveness.
Right.
Mac's natural instinct to connect with people, to read the room, becomes highly functional. It's a survival skill. But the immense danger is that the mask he wears, the funny guy, the tough guy, the unbothered guy, whatever specific persona the unit needs him to be to maintain their morale, starts to fuse permanently to his face.
He realizes that his emotional intelligence, his ability to know exactly who is about to crack under the shelling and needs a kind word or a joke or a cigarette, makes him the emotional glue of the unit. He keeps them from falling apart.
But at what cost?
Exactly. In doing so, his own inherent sensitivity, his core sense of self, is placed at massive risk. War fundamentally punishes softness. It mechanically demands that you compartmentalize your trauma, bury your grief, and violently suppress your empathy for the human beings you are ordered to kill. Mac recognizes a terrifying psychological truth in these notes. He realizes that if he completely stops performing, if he strips away the carefully constructed masks and stays truly, vulnerably authentic to his core self, his empathy might make him hesitate.
Which is dangerous.
Very. He might not be an effective killer, he might not help win the physical war, but, crucially, he won't lose his own humanity.
He writes this line that just stops you in your tracks. The scariest part of the war isn't dying. It's losing yourself slowly, piece by piece, and not noticing until it's too late.
That's chilling.
And I want to turn that concept directly back to you listening to this right now. Obviously, you're not sitting in a muddy, freezing trench in 1943, but look at the mechanics of your own life.
Think about your day-to-day.
How often in your daily routine, in your corporate workplace, in your complex social circles, or even within your own family, do you put on a carefully constructed mask to survive your own daily battles?
We all do it.
You shrink yourself, you play a role to maintain the peace, to ensure you belong to the group. At what point does that mask stop being a temporary, useful tool and start becoming a permanent fixture? At what point do you look in the mirror and realize you've forgotten who is actually underneath it?
That slow erosion of the self is the psychological toll of any prolonged struggle, whether it is a global military conflict or a deeply internal battle for identity. And as we synthesize the profound, layered lessons from Mac's notes, this becomes the absolute core takeaway of our deep dive.
Yeah.
World War II wasn't merely a historical demonstration of what humanity is physically willing to destroy. The broken cities, the shattered economies, and the staggering death tolls are just the visible external scars.
The war was a deafeningly loud, planetary warning about what humanity is willing to become. It shows us the mechanical reality of what happens when fluid human identity hardens into rigid, weaponized categories. It shows us what happens when political power centralizes without democratic checks, and when the suffering and dehumanization of the other is normalized as a perfectly acceptable, necessary step for our own perceived security.
And we have to remember, bringing this right back to your reality today, the specific ingredients that baked that catastrophic cake in the 1920s and 30s have not disappeared.
They are still here.
The feeling of being entirely unheard and abandoned by your political institutions, the feeling of being unseen by your society, the deep, gnawing economic fear of losing your status or your resources to an outgroup, those ingredients do not belong exclusively to dusty history books.
No.
They're not safely trapped in grainy black and white archival footage.
They show up right now. You see them operating in our modern political discourse. You see them in the fracture of our local communities. And frankly, you feel them in your own internal identity crises. The tectonic plates beneath our feet did not start moving in 1945.
They never stopped.
They are always grinding. The pressure is always building.
Which leaves us with a final crucial thought to mull over as we conclude. We discussed the staggering opportunity cost of the war earlier.
Yay.
We established that World War II proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that humanity possesses the incredible, almost godlike logistical capacity to entirely reorganize our global industries, our complex economies, and our social structures in a matter of mere months to defeat a shared, visible enemy.
So the defining question we must ask ourselves today is this. What profound internal shift, what change in our psychological and political mechanics is required for us to mobilize that exact same planetary machinery, that exact same boundless human ingenuity, to save ourselves from a shared non-human crisis today?
That's the real challenge.
We know we have the tools. We know we have the capacity. What will it take for us to build with the same ferocious, unified dedication that we once used to destroy?
It is a question of motivation versus capacity. And it's a question that demands an answer from all of us before the pressure builds to the point of another rupture.
At the start of this deep dive, we talked about looking at history like a seismograph, only noticing the jagged spike of the earthquake when it's too late. But thanks to the intensely personal, brilliant lens provided by Mac's notes, I think we've managed to dig down below the surface of the paper.
We really have.
We've felt the heat, we've examined the friction, and we've illuminated the deeply human insecurities that are always grinding together in the dark along the fault line. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the ground beneath your feet, keep searching for your own authentic identity, and above all, keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.